The planet had been dead for approximately 47,000 years, give or take a few centuries, which in galactic archaeological terms meant it was practically still warm. The Korvathi expedition had established their research camp in the shadow of what their preliminary scans suggested had once been either a temple, a university, or possibly a very pretentious shopping mall. With extinct civilizations, one could never be entirely certain about these things. Professor Thexanar of the Vestian Concordat stood before the primary structure, all 7 of his optical sensors focused on the walls with the kind of intensity usually reserved for staring contests or existential crises. His exoskeleton gleamed in the light of this system's dying red sun, each plate polished to bureaucratic perfection. Behind him, 3 other senior researchers from various corners of the known galaxy clustered around their scanning equipment, making the sorts of thoughtful humming noises that academics made when they wanted to appear profoundly contemplative, but were actually wondering what was for dinner. The walls were covered in symbols. Thousands upon thousands of them, carved with obsessive precision into stone that had somehow survived the apocalypse that had rendered this world into a lifeless husk. They spiraled up the curved surfaces, marched in rigid columns down doorways, and spread across floors in patterns that would have given any reasonable being a migraine. Dr. Velkoth, a crystalline entity whose species communicated primarily through refracted light patterns, rotated her prismatic form to capture the symbols from multiple angles. Her analysis matrix hummed with processing power that could have run a small planetary government. After several moments of calculation, she projected her conclusion in crisp, academic tones that somehow managed to sound bored despite being literally made of light. "Decorative," she announced. "Purely aesthetic in nature, common practice among pre-technological civilizations to adorn significant structures with meaningless glyphs. They likely held ritualistic or superstitious value." Thexnar clicked his mandibles in agreement, a sound like expensive chopsticks being snapped in half. "Indeed. Note the repetitive nature of the patterns, clearly ceremonial. The civilization here never progressed beyond basic tool use before their extinction event. These markings are no more meaningful than the cave paintings found on 30% of surveyed dead worlds." The 3rd senior researcher, a being whose name was unpronounceable in most languages and thus went by the designation Researcher 93, extended several of its sensory appendages toward the nearest wall. It possessed 17 advanced degrees in xenoarchaeology, linguistics, and ancient cultural studies. It had spent 4 centuries examining dead civilizations. It knew, with the certainty that only comes from tenure and supreme self-confidence, exactly what it was looking at.
"Random symbols," 93 confirmed, its translator box rendering its complex chemical emissions into something approximating words. No grammatical structure, no linguistic markers, no mathematical relationships, simply decorative noise. Rather primitive, really. The junior researchers, those poor souls who had not yet learned that questioning senior academics was a career-limiting move, kept their observations to themselves and dutifully recorded the official conclusions. The symbols were meaningless. Case closed. Time to move on to cataloging pottery shards or whatever else one did when studying extinct species who had been inconsiderate enough to die before inventing anything interesting. The expedition had been on site for 3 standard weeks. They had established that the civilization had been roughly humanoid in structure, had developed basic agriculture, had built cities that were now little more than wind-worn foundations, and had then experienced some catastrophic event that had stripped their atmosphere and boiled their oceans. Standard extinction event, really. The galaxy was littered with similar stories. In another few months, the team would pack up, file their reports, and this world would become another footnote in the great cosmic library of species who had failed to make it past their own planetary boundaries. Then the human arrived. The shuttle touched down with rather less grace than the sophisticated alien vessels that already dotted the landing zone, kicking up dust and making a sound that suggested its maintenance schedule was more of a loose suggestion than a strict protocol.
The cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic wheeze that absolutely no one found reassuring. The human who emerged was a mess by galactic standards. The environmental suit was patched in no fewer than 7 places. The helmet had what appeared to be a sticker of an old Earth cat making a rude gesture, and the overall impression was of someone who had dressed themselves in the dark using equipment salvaged from a recycling center. Thexnar's sensors tracked the new arrival with the enthusiasm of someone discovering an additional meeting had been added to their calendar. Humans. Of course, High Command had insisted on including a human in the expedition. Some nonsense about diversity of perspective and interspecies cooperation, as if a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago could contribute anything meaningful to a field that required millions of years of collective academic knowledge. The human trudged across the landing zone, equipment bags clinking with the sort of improvised organization that made Thexnar's organizational matrices ache. No grace, no elegance, just a bipedal mammal plodding along with the determination of a species too stubborn to acknowledge their own limitations. "You must be the human consultant," Thexnar said, managing to make the word consultant sound like an insult, wrapped in professional courtesy. "Traffic was murder," the human replied, completely ignoring the tone. "Had to route through 3 different relay stations because apparently my credentials weren't processing correctly in the Vestian database. Something about my species designation being filed under miscellaneous primitives instead of the actual research personnel category." Thexnar's mandibles twitched. That had been an unfortunate clerical error that was absolutely intentional. "You have arrived just in time," Velkoth interjected, her light pattern suggesting the crystalline equivalent of barely suppressed amusement. "We have completed the primary analysis of the site. These structures were built by a pre-technological species. The symbols you see are decorative in nature, holding no linguistic or informational value. We will be moving on to cataloging physical artifacts." The human had already started walking toward the main structure, apparently operating under the delusion that the briefing was optional. The academic delegation watched with varying degrees of disapproval as the human approached the symbol-covered walls, helmet tilting back to take in the full scope of the carvings. "These are incredible," the human said, and there was something in that voice that made Thexnar's sensors focus with sudden, unwanted attention. Not awe. Not exactly. Something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. "They are meaningless," Thexnar corrected, perhaps a touch too quickly. "Decorative only. We have run full analysis algorithms. There is no informational content." The human reached out, gloved fingers tracing along one of the carved lines. "Did you try looking at them as numbers?" The silence that followed was the special kind of silence that occurs when highly educated beings are confronted with a suggestion so absurd that their brains temporarily malfunction trying to process it. "Numbers," Researcher 93 finally said, its translator box somehow managing to convey intense skepticism through electronic speakers. "You believe these random decorative symbols are numbers?" "I mean, yeah?" The human's helmet turned, tracking the patterns across the wall. "Look at the repetition, the positional relationships, the way certain symbols only appear in specific sequences. This isn't random, this is a numerical system." Velkoth's crystalline structure flickered in what might have been the light-based equivalent of laughter. "Human consultant, we have analyzed these symbols using algorithms refined over millions of years of linguistic study. If there were numerical patterns, our systems would have detected them." Would they, though? The human was still examining the walls, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were being condescended to by beings whose civilizations had mastered interstellar travel while Earth was still figuring out fire. Because here's the thing about numbers. Sometimes they look like art. Sometimes art looks like numbers. Sometimes the line between the two is a lot thinner than you'd think. Thexnar felt something uncomfortable stirring in his cognitive centers. It felt suspiciously like doubt, which was unacceptable. He had 17 peer-reviewed publications on symbolic interpretation. He had decoded 3 previously unknown ancient languages. He knew meaningless decorative symbols when he saw them. "Your hypothesis is noted," he said, in the tone academics used when they meant, "Your hypothesis is absurd, and we will be ignoring it." However, I assure you, these markings hold no informational content. You may examine them if you wish, but please do not let this distraction delay the actual cataloging work. The human made a non-committal sound and pulled out a battered datapad that looked like it had survived at least 2 small wars and possibly a flood. "Mind if I take some recordings for my own notes?" "By all means," Thexanar said magnanimously, already dismissing the human from his attention. "Let the primitive play with their theories." The real scientists had work to do. As the senior researchers moved away to discuss the actual important aspects of the site, none of them noticed the way the human's hands had started moving faster across the datapad. None of them saw the way those mammalian eyes were tracking patterns, making connections, seeing relationships in the carved stone that their sophisticated algorithms had completely missed. None of them realized that sometimes the most advanced analysis in the galaxy was no match for a species that had spent millions of years of evolution learning to recognize patterns in everything from animal tracks to weather systems to the behavior of other humans who were definitely lying about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. The symbols covered the walls in their thousands, waiting. They had been waiting for 47,000 years. They could wait a little longer. The human had been sitting cross-legged on the dusty ground for 6 hours, which was approximately 5 hours and 59 minutes longer than the senior researchers had expected the novelty to last. The datapad screen cast a pale glow across the faceplate of that ridiculous helmet, and occasionally the human would stand, walk to a different section of wall, trace fingers across the symbols, and then return to sitting and typing with the kind of obsessive focus that made Thexanar's sensors itch with something uncomfortably close to curiosity. He had checked on the human twice, purely for safety protocol reasons naturally, nothing to do with the nagging sensation that perhaps, just perhaps, he had dismissed something important. That was absurd. He had 17 peer-reviewed publications. "Still playing with the decorations?" Velkoth asked, her light patterns suggesting amusement as they both observed the human from a distance that could be considered professional supervision or possibly spying, depending on one's perspective. "Humans have a documented tendency toward pattern recognition obsession," Thexanar replied, which was a polite academic way of saying they saw patterns in everything, including things that definitely were not patterns, like clouds, or burnt toast, or random decorative symbols on alien walls. The thing was, humans had evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill them roughly 60% of the time. Their survival had depended on recognizing which patterns in the grass meant predator, which shapes in the water meant food versus poison, which sequences of behavior in their fellow humans meant friend or threat or someone trying to steal their mate. Their brains had become pattern recognition machines, finding signal in noise, meaning in chaos, and occasionally Elvis in potato chips. The galaxy's older species had evolved past such crude survival mechanisms. They had algorithms, they had computational matrices, they had millions of years of refined analytical processes that produced accurate, logical, unbiased results, usually. The human stood again, this time walking to a section of wall the researchers had already cataloged as repetitive ceremonial glyphs, subsection 47, presumably religious in nature. The gloved hand moved across the symbols, not randomly, but following some invisible logic that existed only in that mammalian brain. Then the human laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the kind of laugh that academics made when they discovered that a rival's groundbreaking theory was based on a data entry error. Sharp, delighted, and more than slightly unhinged. "Oh, you beautiful, brilliant dead people," the human said to the wall, which was definitely not standard archaeological protocol. "You absolute madmen. This is base 8. You were counting in base 8. Thexnar felt his mandibles click involuntarily. Base 8. A numerical system using 8 digits instead of the standard 10 most species used, or the binary that computers preferred, or the 17-base system the Vestians had developed because they had 17 primary sensory appendages, and it had seemed logical at the time. Impossible, he said, approaching despite himself. Our linguistic matrices would have identified numerical systems regardless of base structure. Would they, though? The human turned, and even through the helmet's polarization, Thexnar could sense the grin. Because here's what I'm thinking happened. Your algorithms were looking for numbers that looked like numbers. Proper, organized, mathematical notation. But these people, whoever they were, they made their numbers pretty. Look here. The human pointed to a sequence of symbols that the preliminary scans had labeled as decorative spiral pattern, possibly representing seasonal cycles or religious concepts. This symbol appears exactly 8 times before the pattern shifts. Then this symbol, 8 times. Then this sequence, which breaks down into groups of 8. 64 positions, 512 positions. It's exponential, it's structured, it's counting. Velkoth drifted closer, her analytical matrices suddenly running calculations at speeds that would have overheated lesser processors. Even if these were numbers, and I emphasize the if, what would be the purpose of covering an entire structure in mathematical sequences? Why would any civilization do such a thing? The human was already moving to another wall, that datapad screen filling with notes, sketches, correlations. That's the question, isn't it? Because if this is what I think it is, these aren't just random numbers. Look at the positional relationships, the way certain sequences appear near doorways, the progression from ground level to higher elevations. This isn't decoration. Then what is it? Thexnar asked, hating himself slightly for asking, hating more that he genuinely wanted to know the answer. The human paused, helmet tilting up to take in the full scope of the symbol-covered structure that stretched 30 meters into the rust-colored sky. I think it's a calculation, the human said quietly. I think this entire building is one massive, elaborate mathematical proof, and I think whoever built it needed everyone who came after to understand exactly what they had figured out. And what? Researcher 93's voice crackled from the comm system, dripping with skepticism, could possibly be so important that an entire civilization would carve it into stone for eternity. The human's hand traced one more symbol, a complex glyph that appeared, now that Thexnar was actually looking for it, at regular intervals throughout the structure. I don't know yet, the human admitted, but I'm going to find out. By hour 14, the human had stopped sleeping, which was biologically inadvisable, but academically understandable. The datapad had been abandoned in favor of a holographic projection system that now displayed 3-dimensional models of the symbol sequences, rotating slowly in the air like the world's most complicated mathematical nightmare. Thexnar had also stopped pretending he wasn't watching. Professional dignity only stretched so far, and somewhere around the point where the human had started muttering about recursive sequences and exponential decay patterns, his curiosity had overridden his ego. Talk me through it, he said, settling his exoskeleton onto the ground beside the human, who smelled distinctly of unwashed mammal and obsessive determination. The human gestured at the projection, fingers dancing through holographic symbols. Okay, so once I established base 8, the rest started falling into place. These aren't just numbers, they're equations, mathematical relationships, and they're all pointing toward this. A section of the projection highlighted, showing a complex sequence that spiraled up the main structure's eastern face. It was beautiful, in a way that made Thexnar's analytical centers ache with something uncomfortably close to awe. It's calculating orbital decay, the human said, and there was no humor in that voice now, only grim certainty. Their moon. They were tracking its degrading orbit. These numbers, all of them, they're showing the mathematics of how their moon was spiraling inward, how long they had, what would happen when it finally came apart. Velkoth materialized beside them, her light patterns sharp with sudden understanding. The Roche limit. They calculated their moon would fragment within their gravitational field. Not just calculated, the human corrected, pulling up another sequence. Predicted. Warned. Look here. These symbols near the base, they're temporal markers. Dates. Countdowns. They knew exactly when it would happen. They had decades, maybe centuries of warning. And they spent that time carving the math into every structure they could, trying to explain to anyone who came after what had killed them. Researcher 93's appendages trembled slightly. The atmospheric stripping, the ocean loss, a fragmented moon would have bombarded the surface with debris for years. They saw it coming, the human said quietly. They understood the mathematics of their own extinction. And instead of panicking, instead of descending into chaos, they turned their entire civilization into a teaching moment. Every building, every structure, all of it explaining the orbital mechanics that doomed their world. Thexanar felt his certainty crumbling like the long-dead civilization they studied. Our algorithms missed this. Millions of years of analytical refinement, and we dismissed it as decoration. The human's helmet turned toward him, and somehow he knew the mammal was smiling beneath it. Sometimes you're so busy looking for complexity that you miss what's simple. They were just counting. You were looking for language. I was looking for math. Humans, Velkoth observed, her tone mixing respect with resignation, are exhaustingly good at finding things we've overlooked. We've had a lot of practice being underestimated, the human replied. The expedition's final report would be revised 17 times before publication, each iteration removing a bit more of the embarrassment and adding a bit more of the passive voice that academics used when they wanted to say, "We were completely wrong," without actually admitting fault. The phrases alternative interpretation and supplementary analysis revealed would feature prominently. But in the immediate aftermath, standing in the shadow of structures that had transformed from meaningless decoration into mathematical tombstones, there was a moment of pure, uncomfortable honesty. "We need to scan the other buildings," Velkoth said, her light patterns subdued in a way that suggested the crystalline equivalent of humble pie tasted terrible. "If this structure contains orbital calculations, the others might hold additional information. Climate data, geological
Surveys, perhaps even evacuation plans. The human was already nodding, that data pad back in hand, coordinates being plotted with efficiency that suggested
sleep was still not on the agenda. The structure to the west has different symbol density, could be atmospheric composition tracking. The northern complex might be population census data or resource allocation. Thexanar watched his carefully constructed conclusions disintegrate like ancient paper. 3 weeks of analysis, dismissed in 14 hours by a species whose idea of advanced mathematics had involved counting on their fingers until relatively recently in galactic terms. The irony was not lost on him. The irony was, in fact, beating him over his carapace with considerable force. "I have 17 publications on symbolic interpretation," he said aloud, not quite sure why he was confessing this to the dusty air. "And now you'll have an 18th, the human replied without looking up from the data pad, about how sometimes numbers hide in plain sight when they're made beautiful. About how civilizations facing extinction become teachers. About how mathematics transcends language when you're trying to explain the universe to whoever comes after." Researcher 93 extended several appendages in a gesture that its species used to indicate philosophical acceptance of uncomfortable truths. "In my 4 centuries of archaeological work, I have never missed something this significant. The question becomes, why did you see what we could not?" The human finally looked up, and there was something in that posture that was neither gloating nor apologetic, just matter of fact. Because humans are really, really good at finding patterns. It's basically our superpower. We found patterns in star movements before we understood what stars were. We found patterns in plant growth before we understood agriculture. We found patterns in each other's behavior before we developed language. Our brains are pattern-matching machines running on evolutionary overdrive. And our algorithms? Velkoth asked, genuine curiosity overriding embarrassment. Are probably amazing at finding the patterns they're designed to find. But these folks, the human gestured at the carved walls, they thought like I think. Carbon-based, bilateral symmetry, probably had something like hands, definitely had eyes that saw in similar wavelengths. They counted things, they noticed repetition. They made their math pretty because making things pretty mattered to them. I recognize that because humans do the same thing. We put fractals in our art. We find the golden ratio pleasing. We make our numbers into equations and our equations into architecture. Thexanar felt something shift in his understanding, a recalibration of assumptions that had stood unchallenged for longer than this dead world had been silent. You are saying that your primitive pattern recognition is actually an advantage in certain contexts. I'm saying that sometimes being the new kids in the galaxy means we haven't learned all the proper ways to be wrong yet, the human corrected. You've got millions of years of knowledge telling you how to analyze ancient cultures. I've got a few thousand years of humanity looking at weird stuff and going, I wonder what that does, followed by either a breakthrough or an explosion. Sometimes both. The sun was setting, painting the dead world in shades of amber and rust, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow in the fading light. Thousands upon thousands of calculations, carved with love and precision and desperate hope that someone, someday, would understand what had happened here. We will need to reassess our analytical protocols, Thexanar said finally, which was the closest he could come to saying the human had been right and they had been catastrophically wrong. Or, the human suggested, settling back down with the datapad and a thermos of something that smelled chemical enough to strip paint. You could just bring humans along on your expeditions. We're pretty good at noticing stuff you guys miss. Plus, we work cheap. I'm literally being paid in travel expenses and academic credentials right now. Velkoth's light patterns flickered in what might have been amusement. The human makes a valid point. Though I suspect your superiors will not appreciate the implication that millions of years of analytical refinement can be supplemented by a species that invented spaceflight 3 centuries ago. They'll get over it, the human said cheerfully. Besides, wait until they see what I find in the Western structure. I'm pretty sure that's not religious symbolism. I think that's a periodic table. Thexanar felt his mandibles click in what could have been frustration or respect, or possibly the beginning of a migraine. In the end, he supposed it did not matter. The dead civilization had left their message, carved in mathematics and stone and beauty. They had calculated their doom and transcribed it for eternity, hoping someone would understand. They had been waiting 47,000 years for someone to recognize their numbers. It had taken a human approximately 14 hours. The galaxy, Thexanar reflected, was going to have to make some adjustments to its assumptions about who saw what and why. The alternative was continuing to dismiss the primitive newcomers who kept noticing things that millions of years of sophistication had somehow rendered invisible. He suspected, with the resigned certainty of someone whose entire career was about to become a cautionary tale in academic hubris, which option the galaxy would choose. In the distance, the human was already walking toward the Western structure, datapad in hand, helmet reflecting the dying light, moving with the confidence of a species that had spent their entire evolutionary history finding patterns in chaos and meaning and noise. The scholars had laughed at the meaningless symbols. The human had recognized them as numbers, and in the end, that had made all the difference.